One of the staples of Dovlatov's writing is that he never uses words that start with the same letter in a single sentence. That makes his text almost melodic, and it also makes them easier and more effortless to read. Well, that is until you learn about the trick and start checking every sentence, trying to catch him in a mistake. That kind of kills the effortlessness. Sergei Dovlatov's story seemingly consists of a variety of anecdotes. He was born 3rd of September 1941 in Ufa. His family has just been evacuated from the seized Leningrad. Dovlatov liked to tell the story that then his mother was taking a walk with him as a baby, and she met Andrei Platonov, a famous Russian author. Dovlatov viewed it as a symbolic passing of a torch from one author to the next. After the end of World War II, the family returned to Leningrad. His father was a theater director, his mother was an actress, who later became a corrector. After the parents' divorce, Dovlatov took his mother's last name Dovlatov and not his father's Mechik. His father was Jewish, his mother was Armenian, and that's why in his prose you would sometimes encounter mentions of him being kinda Jewish. Dovlatov was an average student at school, kept not the best company, got into Leningrad University, faculty of philology, and was supposed to study Finnish, but was expelled. His friends said that no one ever really heard Dovlatov speaking Finnish, actually. His expulsion from uni coincided with his first heartbreak. He'd fallen in love with a girl called Ася Pikurovskaya. She was the girl of the social circle, the most beautiful and the most popular. They made quite a striking pair, but it was not a match made in heaven. Ася was a socialite. She liked parties and attention, and Dovlatov was jealous and possessive and in constant need of money, and so he couldn't keep up with her more famous and more successful friends. Legend has it that they'd only gotten married as a result of a bet. It was something like if Ася couldn't drink a bottle of vodka in one go, they would go to the registry office straight away. Ася did drink the bottle, but they still gotten married anyways for whatever reason. The marriage lasted 8 years on paper, but in reality only a few days. Ася soon left him for a writer, Vasily Aksionov. Another legend has it that Dovlatov, in a fit of a jealous rage, locked Ася up in a room and threatened her with a hunting rifle, saying something like suicide wouldn't go well with her, but murder just might. He even shot the rifle but missed. Ася ran away from him in fear, and Dovlatov celebrated their separation with a 3-day alcoholic bender. They somewhat remained in each other's lives. Even after their official divorce, after one night together, Ася got pregnant and gave birth to Dovlatov's daughter, but Dovlatov was never present in the girl's life. The daughter only found out her father's identity after Dovlatov's death. Asia's image appears in some of Dovlatov's works, most notably in the affiliate. But let's go back a bit. Dovlatov was expelled from university because he was neglecting his studies for parties, Asia, and drinking, and expulsion meant military service. He got stationed up north in Komi, and he was working as a guard in a high-security prison. He spent 3 years there, and it's probably the first time that he'd actually had time to write, and the environment also provided some inspiration, and thus the first book, The Zone, a prison guard's story, was born. Dovlatov there noted a very special type of relationship that the prison guards and the prison mates had. They felt almost equal to each other. When Dovlatov returned to Leningrad, Brodsky noted a certain similarity with Tolstoy, who returned from Crimean War, with a notebook full of stories and a certain daze in the eye. Upon his return to Leningrad, Dovlatov studied at university again, journalism major this time, but this time he had a goal in mind. He wanted to be a professional writer. He envisioned himself becoming not like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, but somebody like Alexander Kuplin, maybe not the most famous of writers, but a perfectly good one. But even with a somewhat more realistic goal like that, it was not easily achievable. Even if we set aside the more obvious setbacks like his lost years up north, his alcoholism, or constant money problems, it was not that easy to become an author in USSR. In USSR, that meant not only complying with the propagandistic message, but being the beacon of it. Some authors managed to walk this fine line between artistic integrity and the Soviet messaging. For example, there was a little bit more freedom in children's literature, but for Dovlatov it became almost an impossible task. Researcher Lev Lurie notes that Dovlatov could switch to this expected propagandistic tone and voice in his journalism, as if he put on this character of a simpleton, enthusiastic Soviet journalist. But in his fiction, Dovlatov couldn't pretend. He wrote what he thought he needed to write and not what was expected of him. Fate also played a role here. Dovlatov had a chance at becoming a professional author. He was invited to a public reading that could have led to him being accepted into the Union of Soviet Writers, a main requirement for being considered a professional writer. Dovlatov even had success at that reading. People were in hysterics about his story, but a letter was submitted to Leningrad KGB saying that the entire event was anti-Soviet, that people who read there were all liberals, and that put on a full stop to any publications to those who were at that public reading. And so Dovlatov couldn't publish any of his fictional writing, but even his journalistic work was under threat. His family life with his wife Yelena was also suffering quite a bit because he was drinking more and more, and so his friends suggested a different opportunity to Dovlatov. 1972 to 1975, Dovlatov lived and worked in Tallinn, Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, mostly working as a freelance correspondent for a paper called Soviet Estonia. It was really political reasons because there was a certain quota of Russians who were supposed to work in Estonian papers, so it was much easier to get published there. Dovlatov's life in Estonia is covered in humorous details in his book The Compromise. In Tallinn, Dovlatov had a long affair with a woman called Tamara. He was supposed to stay with her a couple of days when he'd first arrived in Tallinn, but he ended up staying for 3 years. Tamara found out that she was pregnant just as Dovlatov was leaving Tallinn for good. And why did he have to leave? Well, he was actually close to getting a series of his short stories published, and he gave them to a man to read. And that man ended up being part of underground democratic organization. And that organization was searched by KGB, and they found that book of Dovlatov. And thus Dovlatov was now associated with this anti-communist organization. And so it was time for him to leave Tallinn. Dovlatov then returned to Leningrad to his wife and daughter there. He found some work in papers. During the summer months, he was working in a Pushkin Museum reserve in Mikhailovskaya. That period of life is described in his book Pushkin Hills. But life wasn't easy, family or work-wise. Yelena wasn't happy, so she made a decision to immigrate. She took the daughter and they left for USA. Dovlatov stayed behind. He was working and drinking, he was writing, but nothing was allowed into print in USSR. The turning point happened when some of his stories were published abroad. Apparently, it was an unspoken social contract between the Soviets and their government. The government was willing to overlook quite a few things, maybe deny you certain opportunities, but let you live. But apparently this was unacceptable. I didn't mention it in the Strugatsky video, mostly because they'd gotten away with it, but even they, the members of the Soviet Writers' Union, when their books were published abroad without their knowledge or consent, they had to grovel and publicly apologize for it. But Dovlatov was not as well positioned. He had a reputation, quite a few vices, and so he made quite an easy target. In 1978, he was arrested under a fabricated charge of drunken disorderly, was detained for 15 days, likely beaten there, and then offered a choice to either go east to the prison colony or go west into immigration. Within a month, he and his mother left USSR for good with the Israeli visa. They ended up in New York, Forest Hills, where Dovlatov reunited with his wife Yelena and their daughter, and that's the experience that we're going to be talking about in the Suitcase. The life in immigration didn't really agree with Dovlatov, though. It is weird because he was getting published. For the first time in his life, he was publishing his stories. Everything that we now have available to us was first published in the USA. His stories got into the New Yorker, an honor that out of all of Russian authors, only Nabokov had before. Dovlatov also worked for Radio Svoboda, a dissident radio station that was transmitting in USSR, and he also started a then failed paper, The New American. But Dovlatov never managed to fully integrate himself into the life in emigration. He was disconnected from his audience that was left behind in the USSR. The immigrants of the 1980s didn't fully get him. And his vice of alcoholism was not helping matters. After one of his 7-day benders spent at a friend's house, he came home, he went into shower, and he had a heart attack. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, 24th of August 1990, aged 48, on the 12th anniversary of him leaving the USSR. He is buried in the Jewish cemetery in Queens, New York. In his will, he requested that nothing gets printed outside of what was written in the USA. So a whole bunch of stories, poems, letters that were written in the USSR can never be in print. The bitter irony of Dovlatov's story is that his books were starting to get published in the late 1980s here in Russia, and in the 90s he gathered a massive cult following. So he missed out on the recognition and success that he'd always craved by just a few years, really. Okay, so I'm gonna level with you. I'm not the biggest Dovlatov fan. I don't actively dislike his writing, I'm just simply kind of meh on it. I don't feel the urge to check out every single thing that he's written. I've read 3 of his pieces, and I think it's given me a pretty decent feel of what his writing is, and it's perfectly okay. His style is light, it is funny on occasion, but I don't see anything truly groundbreaking here. Dovlatov has a passionate fan base that swears by him. They claim that we all have a little bit of Dovlatov's humor in us, and a thing that I somewhat agree with is that modern authors are influenced by him. Studies of Dovlatov have the same problem that I've brought up in the Yerofeev video. All of the famous research of Dovlatov are his former friends. And it's a double-edged sword, really, because they do have the most context as to who Dovlatov was, about his works, his influence, his work ethics, etc. But at the same time, I cannot help but question their objectivity. And I'm not deluding myself into thinking that we have a completely objective view of authors who lived 200 years ago now. Objectivity in general has very little space in literature. But Dovlatov hasn't yet stood the test of time, so only history will prove who was right or wrong here. Will he be the Chekhov or Kuprin of his generation, or will he sink into the oblivion like so many before him? My tentative thinking is that his popularity is going to go down once his generation dies out, but I might be wrong here. As I was researching for this video, I've seen quite opposing views on Dovlatov, and ironically, the most interesting perspectives were provided by those who were quite critical of his writing. Imagine that. Some things and criticisms can be applied to most of his writings, so we'll try to use the Suitcase as a guide. So let's quickly recap the plot of the Suitcase and talk about those themes and criticisms. The framing narrative is that the protagonist, called Sergei Dovlatov, is living in USSR and only is allowed 3 suitcases, but in the end only needs 1. Upon his arrival to the United States, he puts the suitcase away and forgets about it until one day his son stumbles upon it, and Dovlatov takes the suitcase out and takes the items out and remembers the stories associated with each item. Each chapter is thus titled after an item in the suitcase, and Dovlatov tells the story of how he'd acquired the item. The Finnish crepe socks is a story of easy money in Leningrad in the Soviet Union. Dovlatov runs into a guy called Fred. Fred is a black marketeer. He makes business with Finnish tourists who come to Leningrad. He buys stuff off of them and then sells it in USSR for 10 times more expensive as it is imported from Finland. This time they buy pairs of synthetic socks, only to find out the next day that these same socks, now made in USSR, are sold in all of the shops across the land and for much cheaper. And thus both Fred and Dovlatov end up with 200 pairs of the same socks. The Nomenklatura of Boots is a story of stealing in the USSR. Dovlatov works as a stonecutter. He and his colleagues are tasked with making a Lomonosov statue for the new metro station. The days before the official opening are spent mostly drinking. Dovlatov, as the youngest, is sent to fetch the new bottles of vodka, and it's a few hundred steps up to the surface for each trip. On the day of the grand opening, during the banquet, the mayor of Leningrad, he takes off his apparently new shoes and Dovlatov steals them under the table. A decent double-breasted suit. In this story, Dovlatov works for a paper and he makes a deal with his editor that Dovlatov is going to write him 3 socially significant pieces, and in return the paper is going to buy him a new suit in order for Dovlatov to attend official meetings and occasions, mostly funerals. The articles don't really work out for Dovlatov, but he gets the suit anyways after he spends a day with a Swedish man whom KGB believes to be a spy, and they recruit Dovlatov to help them in apprehending him. An Officer's Belt is a story from Dovlatov's time working as a prison guard. One day he's tasked with taking one of the prison maids to a psychiatric facility. They walk there along with another prison guard called Churilin. All 3, the 2 guards and the prisoner, they get drunk together, and Churilin gets violent and knocks Dovlatov out with his belt with a huge metal belt buckle. When Dovlatov comes to in the hospital, Churilin sneaks in to see him and they exchange the belts, so the belt cannot be used as aggravating evidence. Fernand Léger's Jacket is a story of Dovlatov's childhood and the family of Nikolai Cherkasov, with whom they were quite friendly. It depicts the differences in Dovlatov's childhood and the childhood of his friend, the son of a famous actor. The jacket was a gift from the mother, Nina Cherkasova, who claimed that it used to belong to Fernand Léger, a famous French painter, sculptor, and filmmaker. A Poplin Shirt is the love story between Dovlatov and his wife Yelena. He tells a version of their first meeting. It needs to be noted in his stories Dovlatov has described 3 different versions of their first meeting, and none of them true. And he describes their life together, how different they are, and yet they still love each other, even if it's not this explosive type of love. When Yelena leaves for the USA into immigration, she buys him this Poplin shirt. The Winter Hat is the story of Dovlatov's relationship with his beloved cousin Boris, and maybe slight jealousy towards him. In the story, they spend time with 3 women who were all very much enamored with Boris. That is until Dovlatov gets beaten in the street and they instantly switch their attentions to him. The next day, Boris gets drunk, tries to find Dovlatov's assailants, gets into a fight with a completely different man and takes his hat and then gifts it to Dovlatov. In the Driving Gloves, Dovlatov gets roped into participating in an independent movie about Peter the Great appearing in the Soviet Leningrad. Dovlatov gets dressed as Peter the Great, he works around Leningrad, and it all culminates in a scene in the line to the beer stall where no one really cares that he's dressed as Peter the Great as long as nobody cuts the line. And so all of them, a worker, an intellectual, they want to be filmmaker, and Peter the Great, they all get drunk together. And Dovlatov gets to keep the suit along with the gloves. That's it. The Suitcase, like most of Dovlatov's work, is a good example of autofiction. Autofiction as a genre exists on a border between autobiography and fiction. The author tells his own story, sometimes in third person, but it's still fictionalized. He may change the course of the events, characters, or dialogue. Some describe it as a heightened version of reality, but really it's simply using real events to feed the narrative purpose and turn them into fiction. Because imagine, you're having a conversation with your pals, everybody's having a good time, everybody's joking, all of that, and you think that it might actually make a good scene. If you write it down word for word, it's not going to work. Not only because the reader does not have the full context or doesn't get the inside jokes, but because real life doesn't work according to literary standards, i.e. what we expect from the book. You would need to trim lines or full conversation parts, add context and backstory, and also work on stylistic choices, etc. And Dovlatov does a lot of that. All his short stories are rooted in reality. The events and set pieces have actually happened. The characters are based on real people, but it is still fiction. Dovlatov's friends who have appeared in his stories have said as such. I've never said these exact words, but I might as well have done. And Dovlatov probably also phrased it better. On the flip side, there are people out there who are quite upset and offended at how Dovlatov chose to portray them. And to that we say it is not an autobiography, it's not a documentary, so chill. I like the way that Igor Sukhich put it. A feature of Dovlatov's writer style is plausible fictional story disguised as reality. Dovlatov's imagined stories, they feel real. One of the main staples of Dovlatov's writing is his conciseness. In this sense, he follows in Chekhov's footsteps rather than somebody like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. Authors like Tolstoy liked long-winded sentences, long depictions of nature, set pieces, inner workings of their characters. Dovlatov does away with most of it. Dovlatov's prose is much more to the fact, it is concise, and it can actually be a good thing, really, because it is easier to read and thus is more palatable to a wider group of readers. There is an opinion that Russian literature tends to overcomplicate itself, and that is not a marker of good literature in and of itself. It's just that we're so used to Russian classics being these 800-page monstrosities that anything shorter than that is assumed to be less by default. But there is obviously craft in laconism and conciseness, and Dovlatov crafts his stories beautifully. One tool that Dovlatov uses to achieve this conciseness, that is unfortunately completely lost in translation, is that he never uses words that start with the same letter in a single sentence. That actually creates a certain melody to his writing that is not instantly noticeable to the eye or to the ear, but is quite pleasing to our brain. This is how Dovlatov explained his theory in a letter to Naum Sokolovsky. I believe that every novelist should put on some kind of creative bounce, introduce some kind of disciplined moment into his writing. In poetry, the role of such bounce is played by rhyme and size. This discipline principle protects poets from verbosity and emptiness. Prose does not have such a framework. It seems to me that it needs to be introduced artificially. As for me, for the last 6 years I have been writing in such a way that all the words in a phrase begin with different letters. Even prepositions are not repeated. In short, it became an obsessive thought for me. Here, open any last 3 or 4 books and make sure. The very fact that Dovlatov did this shows his dedication to the craft, the amount of work that he put in, and how he viewed literature. And honestly, I don't blame the translator for not doing it. It's crazy. It's just simply such a shame that you don't get this effect if you read his stories in English. Another thing about Dovlatov's writing is that he doesn't judge. Most authors provide their own opinions as to wrong or right, or their characters' actions, or something like that, but it's not Dovlatov's goal. He sets off to document the human existence. In order for him to do that, he needs to be impartial, especially since his characters are not the most stellar of individuals. I've actually seen it used as criticism, that Dovlatov's characters, they are rooted in reality, but they don't go further. Dovlatov, as an author, does not push them, does not test them, does not put them into different situations to see how they would act. You would normally expect the characters to go through a personal journey, a transformation, but not here. And it's all true, but it's up to us really if we view it as a flaw of his writing or not. Dovlatov classified the authors as such. There are storytellers who talk about how people live, there are novelists who talk about how people should live, and then there are writers who talk about what they live for. Don't think me insincere, but I'm not sure I consider myself a writer, he explains in an interview. I would like to consider myself a storyteller. It's not the same thing. The writer is busy with serious problems. He writes about what people live for. And the storyteller writes about how people live. It seems to me that Chekhov had this problem all his life. Who was he, a storyteller or a writer? And Dovlatov understood the assignment, as we say now, especially since the life that people lived in the late USSR was, in a word, absurd. I'm trying to evoke this feeling of normality in the reader. One of the most serious feelings associated with our time has become the feeling of impending absurdity, when insanity becomes more or less normal phenomenon. This means that absurdity and madness become something completely natural, and the norm, that is normal, natural, benevolent, calm, restrained, intelligent behavior, is becoming more and more an out-of-ordinary event. To make the reader feel that this is normal, maybe this is the task that I did not self myself beforehand, but this is my topic, a topic that I did not invent, and I was not the only one who devoted some effort and time to it. If beautiful and genuinely accurate and correct words are needed, then this is an attempt to harmonize the world. And the absurdity of life is what fascinated Dovlatov, and that also fed another staple of his writing, humor. Humor for Dovlatov is not the goal but the tool. The situation where Peter the Great finds himself in a line to a beer stall is inherently comical, but it is simply used to highlight the absurdity of it, how he is accepted into this line without a side glance, how all of these people are united by this fire inside, this anticipation of bliss, this cycle of death and rebirth with a mug in hand. Humor is present in all of his stories in one way or the other, but it's almost never a punchline. It's simply mood, I guess, as humor is simply part of life. But Dovlatov, even as a storyteller, still has things to say, and for me, that's where he stumbles. His stories carry these philosophical ponderings, but to me, they almost seem to be shoved into the text. Normally it's a single sentence, a rhetorical question that resonates with the text but is not fully integrated, so for me it feels almost out of place. Or worse, they read as pseudo-philosophical. When he talks about his love for Asya, he postulates that people can be separated into two groups, those who ask questions and those who have answers. And you think to yourself, what an interesting thought. But Dovlatov instantly moves on with his example and does not elaborate. And since his example is about his insecurity in his relationship with Asya, in his financial situation, this interesting thought is left to the reader, and let's be honest, it doesn't have any depth to it. It reads like a meme that your aunt would post on Facebook, and that's not good. To be fair, sometimes it works, like with Peter the Great at the beer stall. I feel like Dovlatov let the moment breathe a little bit more there, so you get the meaning behind it as well. If we talk about the suitcase in specific, it provides an interesting perspective on the human existence, how a man's entire life can be packed in one suitcase, and even those items are not significant at all. Dovlatov uses physical items as a springboard to talk about the actual things that he brought with him into immigration, the memories, or more importantly, the experiences that shaped him into a man that he is. All items stem from different parts and aspects of Dovlatov's life, like his poor childhood by the side of the rich friend, the prince and the pauper match, his love story with his wife, his vices, his alcoholism, shady businesses, stealing, careers he's had, and all of this presented with dispassion, almost disdain, and acceptance. He's quite literally ruffling through his past, picking it up, looking at it, but it's not emotional. It's a life, a simple one, but it is his. On the bottom was Karl Marx, on the lid was Brodsky, and between them my lost, wasted, priceless, only life. And this is a reflection of the society of the time, the one that is selling finished socks on the black market, that is stealing everything that is not nailed to the floor simply because they can, that is getting into fights, that is drinking every single day with anybody, a worker is drinking with an intellectual, a prison guard with a prison mate, all of that while missing on who their wife is and how much she loves them. And again, this is not a philosophical book where I would spend the entire video talking about themes, but they are there, these nuggets of life that unite us all. Because Dovlatov and his protagonist, they are us. A simple person who by the age of 38 hasn't accumulated anything really worth taking with him into immigration. But the suitcase was written in immigration, and the entire framework is a person who was forced out of his country, but he misses it, he longs for it, despite all its flaws. Dovlatov and his protagonists, they are not rebels, they are not opposing the system. They see it and recognize it as flawed, but they accept it without a word. They adapt, they exploit, they avoid, but in the end, even that is not enough, because the system still does not accept them and forces them out. And so he looks back at his Russia, but even like that, my Russia, you're most precious to me, and tries to find deeper meaning in useless things. At the very least, the book is a sort of a time capsule that captures the atmosphere and the mood of the life in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, 1970s. But even if specific details might not resonate with you, some of it is completely foreign to me as well, I think there is something in there about human existence that is universal, delivered in this slightly ironic, humorous way that you might find appealing.